Martha Jenkins wiped the sweat from her weathered face as she watched her old mare, Belle, graze in the small patch of dried grass behind her cabin. The autumn wind carried the scent of coming winter, and Martha knew she was running out of time. Her husband had been dead for 3 years now, taken by a fever that swept through their small frontier town like wildfire. Since then, she had struggled to keep their little homestead alive with nothing but Belle, her vegetable garden, and the occasional odd job in town. The 42-year-old widow had sold almost everything of value over the past year. Her husband's tools, her mother's china. Even her wedding ring had gone to pay for supplies and medicine when she fell ill last spring. Belle was all she had left, and the mare meant everything to her. The horse had been a wedding gift from her late husband, a symbol of the dreams they once shared about building a life together on the frontier. But now, as Martha counted the few coins in her coffee tin, she faced a harsh reality. Winter was approaching fast, and she had barely enough food to last 2 weeks. The town merchant had already refused her credit, and there were no more jobs available for a woman in her situation. She had been avoiding the inevitable decision for weeks, but deep down she knew what had to be done. That evening, as Martha sat by her small fire, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A weak cry echoed across the prairie, carried by the wind like a ghost's whisper. She grabbed her lantern and stepped outside, Belle nickering nervously in the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time, and Martha realized it was human. Following the voice, she discovered a young Apache man collapsed near the creek that bordered her property. His dark skin was pale with fever, and a deep wound in his side had soaked his clothes with blood. He couldn't have been more than 20 years old, and he was clearly dying. Most settlers would have turned away, or worse, but Martha had always believed that suffering knew no color or tribe. She knelt beside him, and his dark eyes opened briefly. He whispered something in his native language that she couldn't understand, but his desperation was clear in every labored breath. Martha looked back at her cabin, then at Belle grazing peacefully in the distance. She thought about the winter ahead, about her empty pantry and the impossible choice she faced. The young man's breathing grew more shallow, and Martha made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't save herself by selling Belle if it meant letting another human being die right outside her door. Her conscience wouldn't allow it, even if it meant her own survival was now in question. Some things, she realized, were more important than mere survival. Martha spent the entire night caring for the wounded Apache. She dragged him into her cabin, using all her strength to get him onto her husband's old cot. His wound was infected and needed immediate attention. She boiled water, tore up her last clean dress for bandages, and used the precious bottle of whiskey she had been saving for emergencies to clean the injury. The young man drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling in Apache and occasionally in broken English. Through his fevered words, Martha learned his name was Running Bear, and he had been shot while hunting far from his tribal lands. He had been riding for days trying to reach safety, but his strength had finally given out near her creek. As dawn approached, Martha realized the severity of the situation. Running Bear needed medicine that she couldn't afford, and food to help him regain his strength. Her own supplies were nearly gone, and winter was less than a month away. She looked out the window at Belle, who stood silently in the morning mist, almost as if the horse understood the weight of the moment. Martha had heard stories about Dr. Thompson in the next town over. He was known to be a fair man who sometimes treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, but he was also practical. He would want something valuable in exchange for his services, especially for treating an Apache during such tense times between settlers and tribal peoples. The decision tore at Martha's heart, but she knew what she had to do. Belle had been her companion through the darkest days after her husband's death, the one living connection to happier times. The mare was worth enough to buy medicine, food, and supplies that could save Running Bear's life, and possibly see Martha through the winter. But selling Belle would also mean giving up her only means of transportation and her last valuable possession. Running Bear's condition worsened as the morning progressed. His fever spiked and the wound showed signs of serious infection. Martha realized that waiting any longer might mean losing him entirely. She made her choice with tears in her eyes. She saddled Belle one last time and rode to town, her heart heavy with each step the mare took. At the livestock market, several buyers showed interest in the well-trained horse. Belle was still young and strong, exactly what frontier families needed for farming and transportation. The final offer was enough to buy medicine, food, and supplies for several months. Martha signed the papers with a shaking hand, watching as Belle was led away by her new owner. The mare looked back once, and Martha felt as though her heart might break. She had just sold her last connection to her old life, gambling everything on saving a stranger who might not even survive. But as she walked back toward home with her supplies, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The medicine Martha bought began working within hours. Dr. Thompson had provided not only antibiotics but also detailed instructions for caring for such a serious wound. Running Bear's fever broke on the second day, and he began to stay conscious for longer periods. Though still weak, he was clearly going to survive. Martha threw herself into nursing him back to health. She prepared broths from the supplies she had bought, changed his bandages regularly, and sat by his bedside during the worst moments when infection fought against healing. During his lucid periods, Running Bear would try to speak with her, his English improving as his strength returned. He was amazed that a white woman had saved his life, especially at such great personal cost. Martha had told him about Belle during one of their conversations, explaining how she had sold her last possession to buy his medicine. Running Bear listened with growing respect and something deeper, a profound sense of debt that went beyond mere gratitude. As the days passed, Running Bear shared stories of his people and his life. He told Martha about his childhood, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, and about the vast herds of wild Mustangs that roamed the territories beyond the settled lands. His eyes would light up when he spoke of horses, and Martha could see that they shared a deep love for these magnificent animals. Running Bear also spoke of the tensions between his people and the settlers, but he did so without bitterness. He understood that fear and misunderstanding drove much of the conflict, and he had always believed that individual acts of kindness could bridge even the deepest divides. Martha's sacrifice had proven this belief in ways he had never imagined possible. 2 weeks after Martha found him, Running Bear was able to sit up and eat solid food. His wound was healing cleanly, and his strength was returning daily. But even as his body recovered, his mind was troubled. He knew that Martha had given up everything to save him, and that winter was approaching fast. She had been trying to hide her worry, but he could see the concern in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as Martha prepared their simple dinner, Running Bear made a decision. He told her that he needed to leave soon, that his people would be wondering what had happened to him. But he also made her a promise that she didn't fully understand at the time. He said that among his people a life debt was sacred, and that the spirits would find a way to repay her kindness. Martha tried to tell him that no repayment was necessary, that she had acted from her heart and expected nothing in return. But Running Bear insisted that the debt existed whether she wanted it or not. He spoke of his grandfather's teachings about how the natural world maintained balance, and how acts of selfless giving always returned to the giver, often in unexpected ways. That night, Martha lay awake thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been preparing to sell Belle just to survive the winter. Now she had no horse, but she had saved a life and formed an unlikely friendship with someone from a world completely different from her own. She wondered what would happen when Running Bear was strong enough to leave, and whether she would ever see him again. 3 weeks after Martha first found Running Bear by the creek, he announced that he was strong enough to travel. His wound had healed to a pink scar and his energy had fully returned. Martha felt a mixture of relief and sadness at the news. She was glad he had recovered completely, but she had grown accustomed to having someone to talk with during the long evenings. Running Bear helped Martha prepare for winter as much as he could before leaving. He showed her techniques his people used for preserving food and keeping warm during harsh weather. He taught her how to identify edible plants that grew wild near her property, knowledge that could mean the difference between hunger and survival in the months ahead. During his final days at the cabin, Running Bear often stared toward the western horizon with a look of intense concentration. When Martha asked what he was thinking about, he would only smile mysteriously and say that he was listening to messages carried on the wind. Martha assumed this was part of his spiritual beliefs, though she didn't fully understand what he meant. On the morning of his departure, Running Bear insisted on performing a ceremony outside Martha's cabin. He gathered stones from the creek and arranged them in a careful pattern, then spoke in Apache while burning sage he had found growing wild nearby. Martha watched respectfully, sensing the deep importance of whatever ritual he was conducting. When the ceremony was finished, Running Bear took Martha's hands in his and spoke earnestly. He told her that he had asked his ancestors and the spirits of the land to watch over her, and that she would not be forgotten by his people. He promised that the debt he owed her would be repaid, though he couldn't say exactly when or how. Martha tried once more to tell him that no repayment was necessary, but Running Bear shook his head firmly. He explained that among his people, some debts were too sacred to ignore, and saving someone's life created bonds that transcended tribal boundaries. He said that the spirits demanded balance, and that her sacrifice would not go unanswered. As Running Bear prepared to leave, he paused at the edge of Martha's property and looked back at the cabin where he had recovered his strength. He called out to her in Apache, then translated his words. He had asked the wind to remember her kindness and carry word of her generous heart to all the creatures of the wild lands. Martha watched him disappear into the distance, walking steadily toward the western mountains where his people lived. She felt lonelier than she had in months, but also strangely hopeful. Something in Running Bear's manner during those final days suggested that their parting was not permanent, though she couldn't explain why she felt that way. That evening, Martha sat on her porch as the sun set, listening to the wind rustle through the prairie grass. For a moment, she could almost imagine that the wind was carrying messages, just as Running Bear had claimed. She thought about Belle, sold to save a stranger's life, and wondered if she had made the right choice. Winter was coming fast, and she was now completely alone again. But as she prepared for bed that night, Martha realized that something fundamental had changed inside her. The past month had reminded her that life was about more than mere survival. She had rediscovered her capacity for courage and compassion, qualities that had been buried under years of grief and hardship. Whatever the winter brought, she would face it as a different person than she had been before Running Bear entered her life. Winter arrived early and hit harder than anyone had expected. By November, snow was already piling up around Martha's cabin and the temperature dropped far below normal. The supplies she had bought with Belle's money helped, but Martha found herself rationing everything carefully to make sure she could last until spring. The isolation was the hardest part. Without Belle, Martha couldn't travel to town for company or additional supplies. She was completely cut off when the roads became impassable with snow. During the worst storms, she would sit by her fire and think about Running Bear, wondering if he had made it safely back to his people, and whether he ever thought about the white woman who had saved his life. Martha filled her days with necessary tasks, tending her fire, preparing meals, mending clothes, and maintaining her cabin against the harsh weather. She also practiced the survival techniques Running Bear had taught her, though there wasn't much opportunity to gather wild plants in the frozen landscape. Still, his knowledge gave her confidence that she could find ways to stretch her supplies if needed. December brought the worst blizzard anyone could remember. For 3 days, snow fell so heavily that Martha couldn't even see her own fence posts from the cabin window. The wind howled constantly, and she worried that her roof might not hold under the weight of accumulating snow. She burned furniture for warmth when her firewood ran low, and ate the same thin soup for days to conserve food. During the long, dark evenings, Martha found herself thinking more and more about Running Bear's words about debts and balance. She wondered if she had been foolish to believe that some kind of repayment would come. As January arrived with no relief from the harsh conditions, she began to doubt whether she would survive until spring. Her supplies were running dangerously low, and she had no way to get more. One particularly difficult night, as Martha listened to the wind battering her cabin, she thought she heard something different in the sound. Instead of just howling, the wind seemed to carry voices, almost like Running Bear had described. She dismissed this as her imagination, brought on by hunger and isolation, but the feeling persisted over several nights. By February, Martha was down to her last few days of food. She had eaten everything possible, including things she never would have considered before: tree bark soup, roasted acorns, and dried grass mixed with her remaining flour. She was weak from hunger and beginning to accept that she might not survive the winter after all. One morning, as Martha sat by her dying fire wondering if she had enough strength to gather more firewood, she heard a sound that made her heart leap. It was faint at first, carried on the wind like everything else that winter, but unmistakable. The sound of horses moving through snow. Not just one horse, but many. Martha struggled to her feet and looked out her frosted window. At first she saw nothing but snow and bare trees, but then, like shapes emerging from a dream, she began to make out forms moving in the distance, dark shapes against the white landscape coming steadily toward her cabin. As they got closer, Martha realized what she was seeing. A herd of horses moving purposefully through the deep snow directly toward her property. Her heart began to race as she recognized what was happening. These weren't just any horses wandering lost in the winter storm. They were being led, guided by someone who knew exactly where to find her isolated cabin. And as the herd came closer, Martha saw the figure riding at their head. Running Bear, wrapped in winter furs, leading a magnificent group of wild Mustangs straight to her door. Martha could hardly believe her eyes as Running Bear guided the herd of Mustangs into her yard. There were at least 30 horses, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air, their coats thick with winter fur. They moved with the grace and power of truly wild animals, yet they followed Running Bear's lead with complete trust. Running Bear dismounted and approached Martha's cabin with a broad smile. He looked healthy and strong, dressed in traditional Apache winter clothing that had kept him warm during what must have been a difficult journey. When Martha opened her door, he greeted her in English that had improved significantly since their last meeting. He explained that he had spent the months since leaving her cabin learning everything he could about her situation. Through trading posts and conversations with other settlers, he had discovered that Martha was completely isolated for the winter and likely struggling to survive. This knowledge had troubled him deeply, and he knew the time had come to fulfill his promise about repaying her life debt. The horses he had brought were all wild Mustangs from the remote territories where his people lived. Running Bear had spent weeks tracking and gathering them, using skills passed down through generations of his family. These weren't just any horses. They were some of the finest wild Mustangs in the territory, strong and intelligent animals that would be incredibly valuable to the right buyers. But Running Bear's gift was more thoughtful than simply bringing Martha horses to sell. He had also brought supplies, dried meat, warm furs, and other necessities that would see her through the rest of the winter. More importantly, he had brought knowledge about how to work with wild horses, techniques that could turn this gift into a sustainable livelihood. Over the following days, Running Bear taught Martha everything she needed to know. He showed her how to approach the Mustangs, how to gain their trust, and how to begin the process of training them for sale to settlers who needed good horses. He explained which horses would be best for farming, which ones had the temperament for family use, and which ones might be valuable for breeding. Martha learned that these skills could provide her with a way to make a living that didn't depend on anyone else. Horses were always in demand on the frontier, and someone who could train wild Mustangs would never lack for customers. Running Bear was giving her not just immediate help, but a path toward long-term independence and security. The transformation in Martha's circumstances was remarkable. Instead of facing starvation, she now had food and warmth. Instead of being isolated and helpless, she had the beginnings of a new career. Most importantly, instead of simply surviving, she had discovered a purpose that excited her and connected her to the land in ways she had never experienced. As spring approached and Running Bear prepared to leave again, Martha realized that the debt between them had become something deeper than obligation. They had become true friends, connected by mutual respect and understanding that transcended the cultural differences that divided their peoples. She knew that Running Bear would always be welcome at her cabin, and that she would always be welcome in his world. Running Bear's final gift was perhaps the most precious of all. Among the Mustangs he had brought was a young mare with markings remarkably similar to Belle. He told Martha that this horse was special, chosen specifically for her to keep as her own companion. The mare was gentle but spirited, and Running Bear said she would be perfect for Martha to ride when she needed to travel to town or visit other ranches. Years later, Martha's horse training business became legendary throughout the territory. Settlers would travel for days to buy horses from the widow who could work magic with wild Mustangs. She never forgot the lesson Running Bear had taught her about the sacred nature of life debts and the importance of helping others in need. Her cabin became a place where travelers of all backgrounds could find shelter and assistance, and she never again questioned the power of compassion to change the world in unexpected ways.